Okay, let's start then. Thanks everybody for joining us. We just have an hour, so we should get started on this one. As Joe said, we're recording this partly because there are people who possibly can't join us who'd like to listen in to what was discussed, and also we're trying to create some questions that we'll share with everybody that have come out to these various playback sessions we're doing. We, as you know, we're in the second week of a 3-week period for round 2. In round 1 we did the playbacks very early in the process, partly because we recognised that a lot of people weren't familiar with the plan at that point, and therefore doing it early allowed people to at least understand what was thought about and what the documents represented. Given that people generally know that now, in round 2 we thought we would do the playbacks later in the process so that people have a chance to read the documents and then come with more questions, which has been variously successful in different playback sessions that we've had so far. So if we move on, Joe, to the next slide. So the background to this one. Basically, I would say just at the bottom, round 1 was a high level set of documents that were to get people on the right page about the plan and to get people starting to understand the sequence of activities, the kinds of durations that we thought were reasonable at that point, and so on and so forth. Whereas in round 2, as we said, we've provided more specific information, including dates that frame the durations a bit more clearly. We've progressed the thinking around how SIT could be operated and approached, and also we've progressed the thinking in terms of settling on the most likely migration approach for the plan. Less so, we've progressed qualification, and we recognise that that is still somewhat ambiguous. So there has been some progress round 2 versus round 1 plan, and we hope you'll see there's more specific information. We also said that we would truncate the round 2 length from 4 weeks to 3 weeks, partly or mainly actually because we felt there's more time to consume the responses, but also to come back and align with stakeholder groups ahead of round 3. We need to get everybody more on the same page in regarding the plan. And therefore we needed a bit more time to do that. But the quid pro quo was that we were going to ask less questions this time in round 2, which I'll come on to in a minute. So the next slide is really just to focus us on the round 2 and the outcome. So what we want as an outcome from this 3-week period of consultation is to have a better identification of what's likely to be the best approaches, what are likely to be the most reasonable assumptions and activity durations, sequencing, that kind of thing, and to provide the basis for determining whether we're ready to go into a final round 3 consultation period. Round 3 was always going to be short and a kick the tires on a plan. So between us getting feedback in round 2 and starting round 3, we need reasonable stakeholder alignment, and we need to be able to tell you what we now think the plan is going to be. So it's more of a direction setting for that plan leading through round 3. So the outcome of round 2 is particularly important, and we need to take that pause before round 3 starts, go through governance as well, and just be clear that we're all going in the same direction with the same expectations, and we are making progress towards being able to baseline the plan in the timeline that we have originally set out. On the next slide, so just very brief catch up. We provided round 2 more detailed documents, including a Microsoft project plan with the dates in it, and we've progressed the RAID summaries and so on. We also, apart from that, what we called the illustrative timeline. So that basic range of planning documents was an illustration of how the plan could look. It isn't a default. It isn't the default new plan, because it's quite some way off the original transition timetable. So it isn't, if you like, something that Ofgem, if they're asked to approve it, would approve at this stage, because it's quite a lot later than the timetable, and it's not felt that there's anywhere near enough evidence. In fact, I said so at the open day that we're way off having sufficient evidence to justify that illustrative timeline, but it is the set of documents that we provided. We also provided a second timeline, just a PoaP, and it's not a plan. it's a timeline, and it's I would call it the happiest path timeline. So it's with no contingency in there, and assuming everything goes perfectly, then the logic suggests and the sequencing suggests that it's something we should look at, and there are probably things in there that are worthy of further consideration, and certainly I'm sure you have questions about this. The intention is also, though, by having two timelines, PoaP 1 and PoaP 2, is to get us on the page of thinking that actually the plan might be a range of dates. There are precedents for this in faster switching. There was a range of dates, there was a window for go live, and it may well be that we baseline a plan with a range of dates in it, and therefore we're starting to think about two PoaPs here and possibly a range of dates. I'm not saying they would necessarily be between these two timelines, but we want to give you the way to kind of reference your responses. We did provide less consultation questions this time round, as we promised we would, because you've got less time to respond. But we framed the answers that we want more specifically. So we want you to look at both PoaPs, and we want you to tell us your views about the achievability of each of those, and either why you think it is achievable or why you think it's not. It's important that we get the responses from you on both the positives and negatives. So even if you say that's fine and you support that area of the plan, we want to know why you support that area of the plan. And if you don't, we want to know why you don't. And it needs to be evidenced, and we'll come on to evidence in a minute. So we have been much more sparing in terms of the questions we've asked, but they're quite big topics and they're targeted on the big questions. And as we've consistently said, we are concerned that if we don't get sufficient responses from participants this time around, and we don't have sufficient quantity of evidence supporting people's viewpoints, that we're going to have to make decisions in the absence of evidence, which is not what we want to do. We want to build this plan with industry, but it's a contract between us. You need to give us the information to help us do that. You need to give us the ammunition to resist tighter timelines that you and I may feel are less realistic. And you know, the PoaP 2 is a challenge not just for you, it's a challenge for us. We're challenging ourselves and saying, well, that PoaP logically, rationally might be achievable if everything is perfect, but what would we do in order to support that? So, you know, we are also looking at that more challenging timeline and asking how we could make it happen. So it's not just something that we're asking you to think about, it's something we're thinking about. And any plan we come up with and recommend to Ofgem has to pass the test of something we can support and something you can support. So it's just providing different data points, different reference points for you to give us the best information on two different scenarios. And we felt, and certainly Ofgem felt, that it was sensible to do that, but these things shouldn't be misinterpreted. You know, at the moment, the only baseline for this programme is the transition timetable. Everything else is not a plan that's been agreed by Ofgem, and it's not something that's been evidenced sufficiently to convince us either at this stage. Right, the next slide is, I think we made an attempt to try to give guidance on evidence. We asked Ofgem, in fact, what evidence they would be seeing as legitimate supporting evidence for any plan which suggested a delay from the timetable. Their main thrust was they wanted to see plans. They wanted to see either plans that you've produced, they wanted to see either, you know, draft plans or work in progress plans or thinking based on work in progress plans. So it's all about the plans that you're producing. We recognise that some of you won't have produced those plans, those high level plans, even until possibly M3, which is set at the end of next month. And the test for participants at M3 is that you're ready for DBT and you do have those high level plans. So we recognise some of you are still developing those plans. So it's a challenge for you, but you know, the more you can reference your plans and the thinking that you've done in your planning at this stage, the more legitimate the evidence will be seen. If evidence doesn't, you know, provide some quantification of your views, it will be less likely to be considered with great weight in any plan that we come up with. We've obviously suggested other types of evidence, benchmarking lessons from other programs and things you've done in other places. But again, showing quantified evidence to that. So if you think, for example, that you can affect migration over, you know, it will take you longer than 12 months, for example, then you need to evidence that fact, and you might use other experiences as as evidence for that, but show the numbers, show other experience, but not in a kind of, if you like, an anecdotal way, but showing hard evidence to say why. So all of these things are important. So we gave some guidance, and we can talk about guidance on evidence if you like, but we are really keen to see your planning and your planning thinking, and really cough up what you're doing in terms of how you're planning for this program at this stage is probably the best way to do this. And then the last two slides in this intro pack that we sent out were the two timelines. So as I say, we have the illustrative timeline, which shouldn't be seen as the default new plan, because we've sketched out exactly how far it is from the existing timetable, and anything that is along these lines would need really strong evidence, because it does represent quite considerable delay to the programme, and it would mean us materially being into a year later than the original timetable. But we've tried to outline some important points here. I mean, the PoaP, you need to look at the actual underpinning document to see all the tasks. The PoaP isn't supposed to fully represent everything, but we have this. We have, and one of the things we discussed in other playback sessions is we've shown, if you like, critical paths through this, but actually we will try to draw out more typical paths to give a better view of it, because critical path is things that have to have happened by a certain point, so they don't push everything out. I think it would be also helpful for us to show more typical paths through the programme to help communicate this over the coming weeks. But we've tried to call out key points of the approach here. The fact we're basing it on the assumption of a reverse migration approach. We've talked about the SIT approach that we've used in this particular case. We've talked about the fact that we intend to put people through qualification in tranches. We've called out big things, but you really need to look at the Microsoft project plan or the Excel version of it if you have to understand the actual activities, because the PoaP is a very high level summary. And on the last slide, we have this challenge timeline. And again, we've articulated a different SIT approach, but we've called out the same approaches in other areas. So, and the RAID document that we published as well gives more information on the assumptions we're making in relation to that. So I think I've probably said enough to tell you what the PoaPs 1 and 2 are and what they're not. And that should resonate very much with the communication and what was said at the open day and the communication that we've done later. I'm keen not to spend more than 15 minutes introing this, because we wanted to use 45 minutes for Q&A. So I'm going to be quiet now and allow people. The normal way we do this is by hands up, and we'll take hands up as they come on a first come, first served basis. I'm kind of hoping that now you've had the best part of a week and a half to look at the documents. You probably do have questions, and I and my colleagues are here to help answer those questions if we can. So who's going to be brave and be first? I would say also that we invited Ofgem and the IPA to these sessions. They've not always been here, but it's important that we have transparency between all of us on the difficulties and challenges in terms of getting this thing done. I hope we're demonstrating that we're trying to work on a process that works with you on this. So it would be really good if you must have questions in relation to what we provided. If I've answered them all in 15 minutes, I've done a better job than I thought. This could be one of the shortest sessions in history.
Yeah, I mean, Keith, is it worth my just going through the sort of the major query that we had before on earlier sessions, which is
yes,
a little bit more detail about how we're proposing to manage SIT in this PoaP 1.
I think that would be helpful, because we have given a lot more information about that, and some of it might be quite new to people.
Yes, exactly, and it may not have fully come across in the documentation. So yeah, so what we were doing here is we were in this PoaP 1, we're sticking to the same initial planning and procurement and an impact assessment and then DBT that we had originally in in round one of the consultation. But what we've looked at in some detail is how we manage SIT in order to get what we've called a minimum viable cohort. In other words, a sort of a cluster of participants that makes up a coherent system. So that's, you know, some agents, some suppliers, and so on, through SIT as quickly as possible and into live as quickly as possible. So what we've done here is we've said, okay, we're giving you the 3 months plus 12 months for your planning and then your DBT, and then we're starting SIT, and we will start SIT with whichever participants have declared an interest and are ready in time. So it's a kind of, it's an open door. If you can do it and want to do it, then come along. And a bit more than that, what we've said is that actually we're not declaring a single date. We're going to have like a month is the intention at the moment of flex, whereby if you've declared intention but you just got held up at the last minute or something went wrong, then, you know, you've got that month of flex to actually come in. Now we're not saying, oh, you can join in SIT whenever you want to, because that would be a very difficult management prospect from our point of view, but there's a little bit of flex at the beginning. So open door and a bit of flex. And then what I should say as well is the first thing in SIT is that there's what we call the component integration, which is where we progressively put together bits of the system. We don't ask everybody to turn up on day one and expect that all of the systems to communicate correctly. So we have a kind of a progressive thing which is planned. It's described a little bit in the end-to-end testing and integration strategy, but not in much detail. And what we'll do in the next revision, which will happen in the next few months, is describe that in a bit more detail. So it starts with the DIP, obviously, and we put the DIP together with Elexon Central Systems, and then we add either data services or registration services or whatever, and we build up. So you don't all have to be ready on day one, but you have to be ready within a month of your scheduled time. And then what we do, once we've put all that together, we start SIT functional, and we will closely monitor how each participant is moving through SIT functional. And we will then, at a certain point, we'll kind of take stock a bit, and we'll pair up people from a testing point of view. So we'll say this data service, this agent, you need to work with this supplier or these two suppliers or whatever, so that we get the testing participants who are working the fastest together, and then, so that each group of testing that's going on is working at the same pace, and you haven't got an organization in the group which is having some difficulties and holding the other people up. And the idea of the minimum viable cohort would be the fastest moving group, and we would get that group to move through SIT as fast as possible, and then move into and once SIT functional has been done and those participants have successfully completed their part, they can then go into end-to-end sandbox testing. Now, there'll be a bit of residual SIT to do, but the important thing is, after the SIT functional, you get into the sandbox, you can do your own testing, and that's really helpful. And then we move down to the prep for go live and the go live and the start of the migration period. And the idea is that other participants who aren't in that fastest moving group in the MVC, they carry on. We're not going to kick anybody out of SIT or anything like that. They carry on, so they can still get a time advantage by getting to go live relatively early. Not as early as these guys, but probably earlier than the non-SIT participants, or at least not later than them. And then they go through and get to go live in their way, and qualification opens up once SIT functional is complete, and the participants who qualify then go live you know, in the standard way. So it's kind of done so that we get a fast moving contingent going through sit and getting live early. And I think, you know, the idea there is to encourage people to come into sit because it's a necessary stage to prove the system. And those people who can get to sit on time and get through sit quickly can then go live early and reap whatever commercial benefits they foresee from going live early. Any questions or comments on that?
All makes sense. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, okay, no worries. One of the other things that we said we would do, we'll provide a bit more supplementary information next week. Keith referred to the sort of the individual participants path through. So what we've got on this is the critical path of the programme. A participant's critical path would be a little bit different. And I think, for example, you know, end-to-end sandbox execution would, I'm imagining, would be on your critical path as a participant. So we'll provide those kind of pathways through. The other thing that we said we'd provide is a sort of an extract from the environment plan, because I appreciate that not everybody has been able to participate in the environment working group, and part of what you need to know is how many environments do you need to stand up, roughly when do you need to stand them up, and so on and so forth. So we'll provide some more information on that. And I think, we were going to put something at this level as well on in the next round. We're going to put a little bit about the DIP schedule. So at the moment we've got DBT for central systems in a block, and obviously that includes the DIP. What we'll try to do, without cluttering the diagram too much, is just kind of identify where those central systems come in and where the DIP comes in.
The other thing I just wanted to add in, Kate, while we've got everyone on the call, is the timescales we've got in the plan for migration.
Yeah.
Joe, if you can just pull it down a little bit to show the second set of migration. Thank you very much. So we would very much, we've been having a number of bilaterals with people to try and gather some evidence around the timescales for migration. And it has been a topic of conversation at the migration working group, but we would very much welcome your views back on the consultation on the timescales for migration. And there are different implications on migration activities depending on whether you're going through the sit stream or whether you're going through the qualification stream, as you can see in the plan. So as Kate said earlier, if you're going through the sit stream, if you're in the MVC or and you're in the blue boxes at the top, you have the opportunity to start your migration earlier. We have currently set that as a 12-month timetable in the plan because we don't at this point have the evidence to support any change to that from the Ofgem transition timetable. But if you can provide us with information on how long you think that might take, and also the corollary is if you're in that MVC sit cohort, you do have more time to complete migration before we get to the designated milestone of M15. The consequences of going through the qualification timescales is that, as you'll see, if you are in the back end of the qualification timescales, the implication is that you have less time for migration than the 12-month window that's set aside in here. So you do need to have a think about how long your DBT is going to take, when you think you'll be ready for either sit or qualification, therefore where you might sit in this plan, and what a realistic timescale is in your view for executing the path that you might be following through. So this is where, you know, some of the typical path work that we're going to share with you to supplement the plan information will help you see the implications on migration as well. We're really keen to make sure that we get the appropriate evidence to back up migration timescales.
I wonder whether it might also be, Kate, you talked about the SIT approach. On the challenge timeline, we did change the SIT approach and we made it a
Yes.
bit more radical. So maybe if we just have a quick look at that as well. Because I think generally speaking, what Jason was talking about in terms of qualification migration is not changed. The challenge timeline just takes out the bits of contingency in the overall timeline that we had, and obviously increases risk and so on. But the big change, I think, which Kate can explain, is how we would suggest SIT is approached in this particular case.
Yeah, so this is a little bit different. Yeah, sorry, Keith, I should have talked about this one as well. So
Fine.
what we've done here is we've looked at how we can approach SIT a bit differently. But the other thing that we've done is that we've said, okay, how about if we say that the initial upfront impact assessment, planning and procurement, and then the DBT for all of the parts of the system that are necessary for SIT. Let's say that we condense that so that you've got so you've actually, what you've got on this is you've got a 3-month period of that 5 months impact assessment, plan, procure. You've got 3 months before you start DBT, and that was something that we explored with the working group when we were developing the plan, and it overlaps with the DBT because procurement and some more detailed planning will probably go on in parallel with the DBT, but at least you've got that 3 months which allows you to then start DBT, and you've got a 9 months of DBT, and that DBT is about doing the design, build and test for everything that we need in order to do SIT. And so what we've said there, it's the DBT of the services, so that's the data services, registration services, UMSO services, etc. DBT of supplier DIP interfaces. So this is where the suppliers are interacting with the DIP, and if they're not using MDR, the suppliers are actually, excuse me, sending consumption data into the data services and so on. So it's all the interfacey stuff on the supplier side. What we're not expecting at that point is that the suppliers have done all the changes to their billing systems and so on and so forth, and your customer correspondence systems. That is in the DBT of the supplier core systems. And obviously that's necessary, but it's not necessary for our SIT because we're testing the MHHS solution. We're not doing the consequential change and your correspondence and so on. So that drops into SIT. And what we've said about SIT is that the minimum viable cohort will be defined at the outset, if you like, rather than defining it as we go along. So this is a more restricted SIT. We've got SIT with the smallest viable number of participants who've already declared their intent, and they need to be ready on day one, already on, at the appropriate time for their role in the system, so we can component integrate them and then start SIT functional. So it's a more tightly managed SIT with a smaller number of overall participants. And again, we're looking to run that as quickly as possible and then get to go live as soon as possible with that cohort. And then the same applies for non-SIT participants as does in PoaP 1, that you've got, as soon as SIT functional ends, then you've got qualification testing starting, or sorry, slightly after SIT functional, you've got qualification testing starting, and the non-SIT participants can then come in and make their way, through the system, through qualification into go live. And again, you've got the commercial incentives on you guys, that if you see a big business opportunity for yourselves in getting to market early with this solution, then you've got the incentive to to go early, participate in SIT, get live early.
There are a couple of knock-on implications of that, just to sort of continue the stream, Kate, which we did brief to other parties. Particularly, I think this was of interest to the central parties, is because we have that restricted small number of participants in SIT, it does mean that we have everyone else going through non-SIT, going through qualification. Therefore, it places a higher number of participants going through the qualification execution later in the process. Now, we've still maintained the 12-month assumption for qualification execution, because that's what was in the original Ofgem transition timetable, and we don't have any evidence to suggest otherwise at the moment. But we are asking the qualification bodies as to whether and what a realistic set of assumptions around qualification is. So again, just to highlight that will mean that there are more parties that go through qualification if you're not one of those small number of SIT participants, and again there is that consequential impact on your time for migration at the back end of the purple boxes. So again, just wanted to follow through that logical flow again, Kate, as we've done previously.
Yeah, thanks, Jason.
And Angelos has got his hand up. We've got the first question. Awesome.
I think something I wanted to just kind of communicate and investigate, and Jason, we discussed this on our bilateral that we had, was around like what those checkpoints and the exit criteria will look like for migration. Things like settlement performance, is that going to be a requirement so as to not leave a post program world where settlement performance is down? I think that's something that's really important. And also, I guess as well, will there be different exit criteria for the minimum cohort and the remaining cohort? Like, will there be different checkpoints, or will there be more, will there be more checks done by the program for that minimum cohort, given that that early migration will provide more or less confidence for the wider migration? Obviously, we're expecting one of the benefits will be that the early migrators will be the ones that will spot those defects and allow an earlier and smoother journey for the remainder. So that's something I'm, I guess, for our organisation, really interested in.
Yeah. Do you want to take the first bit of that, Jason, and I'll talk about the second bit?
I can take the performance assurance bit if that's what you mean, Kate. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So we are talking to Elexon BSC around the definition of the performance assurance framework for MHHS, because that doesn't sit within the scope of the programme. That sits within the remit of the Elexon Performance Assurance Board to set what assurance and settlement performance targets they seek to set. So looking at the 97% and 98% targets that currently sit under the PAB remit and assessing those for an MHHS world. So those discussions are just starting at Elexon for their PAF. So that has been kicked off now, but the development of the performance assurance regime won't sit within the programme, because it really is a BAU activity. We'll support it from a design perspective and to provide information on and support on how the design works, but it's really for the PAB to define what those settlement performance requirements might be, because it'll be down to them to monitor it and assure appropriately. Do you then want to cover the migration elements of that, Kate?
Yeah, well, more about the route through SIT and the MVC and so on. So I think that the first thing to say about that is that it's worthwhile thinking about the purpose of SIT as opposed to qualification. So the purpose of SIT is very definitely to prove the overall solution, to prove that what's been implemented actually meets the design and that it works in an end-to-end sense. So the purpose of SIT is not to prove that each of the participants going through SIT is capable of going live. That's a kind of a byproduct of it, if you like. Yeah, the main purpose is this the whole of MHHS, the solution works. Now, obviously, in order to get people into, we're not going to get anybody in SIT if we say you've got to do SIT and then you've got to qualify and so on and so forth. So, we've said if you do SIT testing with us, then you don't have to do additional qualification testing. You obviously have to do the process element of qualification, but you don't have to do the additional testing. So that's fine. So, so with the MVC, our main sort of purpose of our assurance will be, is the system working? But obviously, since the byproduct is a participant comes out and is the equivalent of having done the qualification testing, we do have to assure the participants as well. So I don't think there'll be any particular difference in our assurance of the MVC participants and the the other participants in the PoaP one. I think it'll be similar. But that is something that we do need to think about a bit more.
Thank
And
you.
Does that make sense?
We do need to think some more around the criteria for M15 as well, Kate, and what state do we expect M15 to reflect?
Yeah, I mean, and Angelos, I think you were asking about SIT exit. So I think SIT exit, the exit of SIT will be all around, has the minimum cohort got through, in the sense that it's proved the solution. So if you're another participant, it's kind of, there's no real SIT exit on you. Like I said, we'll still support you in SIT and you carry on, but you wouldn't necessarily be part of the SIT exit, and they wouldn't necessarily be SIT exit criteria on you, I would say, other than that. Sorry, there would be to make sure that you've done the equivalent of qualification testing, but it would be slightly different from the overall SIT exit criteria. Sorry, that's not a very good answer. Right.
No, that has cleared it up. Yeah, no, there's
Yeah.
definitely cleared it up.
Yeah.
And I'll make a note of that for our response.
Yeah,
If I can just, I was just going to ask one more question about I guess, consultation round 2 in general. Something I'm really interested in is, like, how much or what consideration has been made for the weight that different the different audiences will carry. So, like, central parties, obviously there's a dependency for the suppliers. We're dependent on the central systems working. Even with DNOs and agents, should their consultation responses carry more weight and more influence on the plan than a supplier? Possibly so, but I was interested to know, like, what if that split had been considered, and what the factors were in that.
I think it's difficult to word it. I wouldn't say they have more influence, but basically, it's clear we can't do it without them. So we can't start SIT without all the central systems being there, and we can't start SIT without at least one registration service, network ops. So we do need to bear that in mind. But I think the participants have influence as much as the central systems. We want input from all of you, but that said, we have very hard dependencies on the central systems, and there's only one of each one, whereas there's lots of you participants.
Yeah, but increasingly suppliers have influence in terms of how we get to the end and how quickly we get to the end. And
yes,
therefore,
that's right. So
and that's the really thing is important for you guys is how you get through it and how you migrate and how long you've got, and therefore your evidence is extremely weighted and important. The stronger the evidence you give us suppliers, the real influence you'll have on the tail end of this, because there's this thing could go on for a very long time if we're not very careful. That's partly why we put the reverse migration in as an assumption, but there's still a lot around the kind of regulatory controls and how we get to the end. So I would say it actually the weight depends on the subject as well. We absolutely want a lot of evidence from central parties on how quickly they can get to the point where we can start SIT. We are interested in your evidence about how quickly you can be ready for SIT. That's really important because we can't do SIT without, you know, as Kate's mentioned, a coherent set of people, a cohort that provides that kind of minimum ecosystem to do SIT. So there's huge influence you have, not just at the tail end, but at the front end, in terms of ensuring that we can get the show on the road and get to the end of the road. So we've never really looked at it in terms of weighting a particular participant or constituency response, because the responses are of extreme influence and weight at different parts of the plan. So it doesn't answer the question, because I don't think we can answer the question in that way, in the way it's been phrased in a way. I think, you know, we will, you know, the stronger the evidence, the more influence is what we said. And I think that's still the case. You know, you give us a really good case for things, we will use it. Don't have any doubt about that. We've said we want to, if you like, be an honest broker in this conversation and work with you in building a plan you can believe in and you believe is realistic and deliverable. So the best way to do that is to give us the ammo.
No, that's really helpful. Yeah, like I said, you know, the success of it is, you know, dependent on everyone and you know, different stages. You know,
Yes.
You know, certain questions, as you said, they, you know, the evidence that we could provide might be more or less valuable. But as you know, like I said, there is that hard dependency. So that's what I was mainly concerned about. But no, that's definitely, you know, that definitely won't prevent us, you know, responding. It's more so I was just interested in like whether that had been considered or whether there was some like, you know, because you can't really like quantify these sorts of things, can't score these sorts of things with evidence, but you know, at the same time, we can't just have anecdotal pieces. So yeah, that's really insightful. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I would say that it may well be that one party gives us one really good piece of information that is actually applicable across a lot of those types of constituents. And it might just be the piece of the puzzle that really allows us to kind of open up a debate in a realistic and deliverable way on a particular part of the plan. So it may just be that one party gives us one piece of really strong evidence, and we'll leverage that across the plan. Because if it makes sense to us, the fact that only one party gave it to us is not the point. It doesn't undermine the value of that evidence, because we would say, oh, well, only one person said that, so maybe it's not true. But actually, you know, we've delivered these things before. We will absolutely recognize that's a really good point to make, and we'll basically amplify that across the conversation. So we're almost looking for some really clever thinking and really good evidence, and it may be that we don't get it across 100 participants, we only get evidence from 1 or 2 people, or even 1. But if it makes sense, let's use it. And therefore, you know, in a certain sense, this is a really important exercise that, you know, you might be the person that provides the evidence that breaks the kind of the view on how this can be put together. So it really, everybody's input could be that valuable.
I think, Keith, particularly when we look at the difference between this plan, the challenge plan, and the illustrative plan, which is back on page 6, because as Keith said in the intro, we don't have the same level of evidence behind this challenge plan. You know, the rationalized evidence plan is what we've got on the illustrative plan in plan 6. So, you know, if there are those challenges that sit in the challenge plan, then let us know, please.
Thank you for that.
Good question. It was start with a good one.
Yeah.
We've got 14 minutes left. Don't want to prolong session any longer than necessary. We are here for your benefit and to answer your questions. We've always said that if you don't want to raise a question here, you still can continue to send a question to the PMO mailbox, and they'll direct it to the right person in our team who can answer it. So there's still, you know, another week to go, and we'd be more than happy to answer the questions on a bilateral basis if you prefer it that way, because I recognise in a plenary session like this, it's not always that people feel comfortable with raising specific points that they have from their own organisation's point of view. So that channel's always open. or you can just pick up the phone and ring one of us if you happen to know how to do that. We're a very transparent and open team, and we very much appreciate your engagement. And as has been said earlier, we do proactively set up bilaterals, and we're happy to do those on an ad hoc basis as well during the coming days. If you just want to hop on a call and talk about something, as long as we've got the time and we're available, we're very happy to do that, because we want to help you to help us.
Yeah.
Well, I think in that case, it's for the call. Thanks for your time, everybody. Appreciate it. I recognise that some of you have just come along to hear what other people have got to say. Hopefully, we've been able to give a bit more context to some of you, and we'll continue to do that as much as we can until